Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Dahmer showed signs of emotional detachment and morbid curiosity from a young age. His fascination with dead animals was not just a passing interest. He would collect roadkill and dissect the bodies in the woods near his house, a disturbing hobby that went largely unnoticed. After his parents' divorce and a childhood marked by isolation, Dahmer committed his first murder just after high school, in 1978. His victim was Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker. Dahmer lured him into his house with the promise of drinks, and after several hours of hanging out, Dahmer bludgeoned him with a dumbbell when Hicks tried to leave. He then dismembered the body and dissolved parts of it in acid, scattering the remains in the woods behind his house. This would become a ritual he would repeat many times. After this first murder, there was a lull in his killings for nearly a decade. Dahmer enlisted in the U.S. Army, where he served as a medic in Germany. However, due to his alcohol abuse and erratic behavior, he was eventually discharged. When he returned to the U.S., he lived with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. It was during this period that he began to kill again. In 1987, Dahmer murdered Stephen Tuomi in a hotel room in Milwaukee. He claimed he didn't remember the act, but awoke to find Tuomi dead beside him. He transported the body back to his grandmother's house in a suitcase, where he dismembered it in the basement. From that point on, the killings became more frequent, more calculated, and more grotesque. Over the next few years, Dahmer developed a pattern. He would lure young men, often Black, Asian, or Latino, back to his apartment with promises of money or sex in exchange for posing for photographs. He would then drug them, strangle them, and perform necrophilic acts on their corpses. But Dahmer's depravity didn't stop there. He experimented with preserving the bodies, keeping skulls and genitals as trophies. He took Polaroids of his victims in various stages of dismemberment. He even tried to create sex zombies by drilling holes into his victims' skulls while they were still alive and injecting hydrochloric acid or boiling water into their brains. He hoped this would render them compliant and keep them alive longer for his twisted fantasies, but the procedures were fatal. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Dahmer case wasn't just the brutality of the murders, it was how many times he could have been stopped. His neighbors in the Oxford apartments frequently complained about strange smells, screaming, and the sound of chainsaws at odd hours. One of his neighbors, Glenda Cleveland, was particularly vocal. She repeatedly called the police, reporting strange behavior and the unsettling odor coming from his unit. On May 27, 1991, a 14-year-old Laotian boy named Konarak Sinthasamphone was found wandering the streets, naked, bleeding, and disoriented. Two young women called the police and tried to protect the boy, but when Dahmer returned and claimed that the boy was his 19-year-old lover, the officers dismissed the incident as a, quote, domestic dispute. Despite the protests from the women and the clear signs that the boy was in distress, the police escorted him back into Dahmer's apartment, where he was murdered shortly after. The officers didn't run Dahmer's name through their system, which would have revealed he was a registered sex offender, convicted of molesting Konarak's older brother just a few years earlier. They also failed to notice the disturbing smell of decomposing flesh in the apartment, or to see the photos of dismembered bodies lying in plain sight. Their negligence allowed Dahmer to continue killing. In fact, audio recordings later revealed the officers making homophobic jokes after the incident, laughing about helping a gay lover spat. Dahmer's killing spree continued until July 22, 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Dahmer had lured Edwards to his apartment under the same pretense, money for photos, but something felt off. Edwards noticed the smell, the strange behavior, and saw a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner. When Dahmer tried to handcuff him, Edwards fought back, eventually managing to run out the door and flag down police. When officers entered Dahmer's apartment, what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. Inside, they discovered human remains in various states of decay. There were severed heads in the refrigerator, a heart and other organs in the freezer, skeletons and skulls arranged like decorations, and photo albums filled with Polaroids of dismembered bodies. The blue drum in the corner contained decomposing torsos soaking in acid. Dahmer admitted to killing 17 young men and boys between 1978 and 1991. During his confessions, he described his actions in chilling detail, often with no emotion. He expressed guilt, but also stated that he couldn't help himself, that he was driven by urges he didn't understand. The public was horrified. The media swarmed the story. People couldn't believe how the police had missed so many red flags. Protests erupted, especially among Black and LGBTQ+ communities, whose members made up most of Dahmer's victims. There was widespread outrage at how the justice system had failed the victims, how racism, homophobia, and systemic neglect had allowed a serial killer to go unnoticed for so long. The two officers who returned Konarak to Dahmer were briefly fired but later reinstated with back pay. Dahmer stood trial in 1992. His lawyers attempted to plead insanity, citing necrophilia, cannibalism, and delusions as proof. But the court ultimately found him legally sane and sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. He was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, but his time behind bars was short-lived. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death with a metal bar by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, who later claimed that God had told him to kill Dahmer and another prisoner. Reports suggested that Dahmer had been unrepentant in prison, even fashioning severed limb sculptures out of prison food and joking about his crimes. The Jeffrey Dahmer case remains one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, not only because of the heinous nature of the murders, but because of how easily they could have been prevented. The victims were young, marginalized, and often ignored by society. The police dismissed neighbors' warnings. They disregarded the cries of a 14-year-old boy. Dahmer manipulated the system, used societal biases to his advantage, and operated in plain sight. His story is a haunting reminder of what happens when apathy, prejudice, and neglect intersect with pure evil. To this day, the families of the victims continue to grieve, and the story of Jeffrey Dahmer remains a chilling cautionary tale that should never be forgotten.